Greetings, fellow traveler. Tired of the hardships of your journey? Here, take a seat by the fire and let me spin you a grim tale of a dark future where there is only war. Today, we shall continue with the human civilizations the Imperium discovered during the Great Crusade. In today's video, we will cover the Auretian Tecnocracy, one of the civilizations encountered by Horus that possessed power armor and bolt weapons similar to those of the Astartes, thanks to having preserved functional STCs from the dark age of technology. But before we get to all that, we'll go through a few other civilizations that I hope you find equally interesting. So without further ado, let's get into the lore. The Empire of Gardinaal comprised around 11 worlds at the galactic east. This empire was ruled by a military aristocracy that had consolidated its power thanks to their industry that had survived Old Night. Seeing the well-equipped armies of Gardinaal, the Imperium licked its lips and thought, them soldiers and industry look tasty indeed. Firstly, the Imperium sought to open negotiations with a diplomatic delegation to see if Gardinaal was willing to join the Imperium. This delegation was escorted by an honor guard of 1,000 Scions, which turned out to be crucial. At first, Gardinaal seemed keen to join the Imperium, but soon the 1,000 Scions detected a psychic attempt to subvert the Imperial emissaries and answered in kind by slaughtering the delegation from Gardinaal and returned to Imperial territory to report their treason. Since the Imperium had been betrayed going the easy way, now they would try the hard way, sending an expeditionary fleet comprised of Ultramarines, Imperial Army, and Titans of Legio or Taurus. The initial battle was successful in conquering one of the planets on the outskirts of the Empire, establishing a beachhead and a blockade. However, they would fail to take the capital world of Gardinaal Prime and suffered great losses against advanced STC-developed weaponry and were forced to fall back, having lost half their Titans, a great number of legionaries, and 500,000 Imperial soldiers. With such a scale of losses, the Ultramarines were unable to continue the campaign and eventually requested support. A petition that was answered by Ferrus Manus at the head of an armada of Iron Hands and Emperor's Children. In the second attack on Gardinaal Prime, the Emperor's Children carried out diversionary attacks across the planet to distract and keep the enemy busy, while the Iron Hand clan spread out through the planet's industrial complexes to capture them without damaging their infrastructure. The coordinated attacks by the Iron Hands across thousands of combat zones proved effective and efficient, and when the Lords of Gardinaal saw their kingdom fall, they surrendered unconditionally. However, Ferrus Manus rejected their offer, leading a final assault on the capital city of Gardinaal Prime. Having failed their duty the first time, the Ultramarines asked Ferrus for the opportunity to redeem themselves by participating in the final assault. Ferrus accepted, and the Ultramarines marched to battle. The Lords of Gardinaal threw all their remaining forces into the fray to try and repel the Imperials, once again causing heavy casualties amongst the Ultramarines. Ultimately, the Imperium was victorious, and the military forces of Gardinaal were systematically destroyed. After his victory, and with the Lords of Gardinaal defeated and annihilated for their affront to the Imperium, Ferrus Manus declared that his task was complete, that the civilian population of Gardinaal Prime would be accepted into the Imperium of Man, and that their planet and industrial infrastructure would be put to good use in the service of the Great Crusade. When the rest of the planets of the Gardinaal Empire saw what had happened, they surrendered unconditionally and were also incorporated to the Imperium. A few years later, Gardinaal's industry was operating efficiently, proving to be of great value to the Imperium of Man, making this victory and imperial compliance on the part of Ferrus Manus a textbook example for other legions to follow, carrying out only the necessary destruction without harming the innocent civilian population and keeping the planet's infrastructure and resources intact so they could later be of use to the Imperium of Man. The Scions of the Storm were a highly superstitious civilization that dwelled upon the world designated as 4716. This planet had been isolated from the rest of mankind during Old Night for over 4,000 years, but somehow still held on to myths of their Terran origins. Despite worshipping what seemed like pagan idols, they petitioned to join the Imperium of Man. Now, sure, their superstitions might be a problem there, but surely they could be illuminated by the imperial truth and be persuaded to discard their primitive superstitions through the work of the iterators, right? Sadly, this society was discovered by post-monarchia Lorgar, who had just found a new faith in the Dark Gods. And so, Lorgar declared war on 4716 with the excuse that these were heathens whose beliefs did not align with the imperial truth. The word-bearers bombarded the planet from orbit for 12 hours, killing 190 million in a matter of hours. However, the capital city had survived the bombardment thanks to its advanced energy shielding, and so the word-bearers deployed on the surface for a final assault. This didn't prove to be so easy though, as the Scions of the Storm possessed quite advanced technology in the form of intelligent machines that took the form of crystalline tripods. These tripods could shoot what seemed like bolts of lightning that would burn Astartes to a crisp regardless of their power armor, and can even penetrate Predator and Land Raiders' armor plating. These intelligent machines would raise even more red flags for the Imperium. The superstitions these people held could be overlooked if they discarded them and accepted the Imperial truth, but having AI? Well, that's a big no-no for the Imperium, and they would seek to destroy their thinking machines with extreme prejudice. Anyway, back to the battle at hand. Captain Saur Talgron of the 34th Company managed to penetrate the shield and enter the palace, where he found that the population of this planet were no mere heathens. They worshipped the Emperor himself as a kind of storm god. Somehow, Lorgar's Lectitio Divinitatis had reached this world, and its people had started to worship the Emperor in their own way, which would explain why they were so keen to join the Imperium. Upon realizing this terrible truth, Saur Talgron feels his legion has made a grave mistake. They were slaughtering the faithful, a people who shared their own beliefs. Talgron contacts Lorgar, and suddenly, Lorgar, Corferan, Erebus, and a squad of Terminators teleport to his location. Talgron tries to explain the situation to his Primarch, but Lorgar reveals that he has found a new faith, and gives the order to Erebus, who murders the priest, while Corferan and his Terminators slaughter the civilians. The people of 4716 were indeed far from the Imperial truth, but perhaps with some guidance and destroying their intelligent machines, they could have joined the Imperium of Man. In any case, they didn't deserve such a tragic end. A shame, Lorgar was already in the service of the ruinous powers. 6319 was the first world encountered by the Lunar Wolves in Horus Rising. Horus's expeditionary fleet happened upon this system by pure coincidence when they had to translate back to reality due to warp storms. The human civilization of this world seemed to be a cheap knockoff of the Imperium of Man. They had advanced technology, believed themselves to be legitimate heirs of the human civilization of the Dark Age of technology, their planet was the third in a system of 9, their homeworld was also called Terra, and they even had a self-proclaimed emperor that sat on a golden throne. Except this throne wasn't some piece of ancient mysterious tech, it was just literally a throne made of gold. When Horus sent Hastur Sejanus as an ambassador for the Imperium, and he suggested to the false emperor that there was another emperor of mankind, he and his retinue were brutally slaughtered by the emperor's guards. Despite mourning the loss of one of his most beloved sons, Horus sent a second diplomatic delegation, this time led by Malagast. However, the forces of the false emperor shot his shuttle down and sent 600 battleships into orbit. While the orbital battle raged on, the Lunar Wolves descended to the surface under the command of Abaddon with the support of half a dozen Titans. The 10th Company and Garviel Loken were the first to enter the false emperor's palace. On their way to the throne room, they met the emperor's elite guards, known as Invisibles, who, you guessed it, were equipped with technology based on force fields that distorted the light around them, rendering them invisible even to Space Marine helmet sensors. This effect wasn't entirely perfect though, as it would diminish slightly while moving, and after applying high contrast tools on their display, the Marines could see them as heat waves through the air. These Invisibles wielded powerful weaponry, also based on force field tech, that fired invisible beams capable of penetrating through power armor. The Invisibles initially posed a threat and caused a handful of casualties to the 2nd Squad of the 10th Company, and curiously, their ornate silver armor and red silk cloaks reminded Loken of the Custodes. Well, more like an inferior brand of knockoff Custodes in any case. In the end, Horus himself executed the false emperor, giving rise to Loken's prophetic phrase, "I was there the day Horus slew the emperor." After obtaining victory over the capital, some areas of resistance remained, and Loken was deployed to the mountains known as the Whisperheads, where his sergeant Jubal was possessed by the demon Samus, which traumatized everyone who witnessed it, as the supernatural and things like demons were something that the Emperor's teachings denied, and yet they saw it with their own eyes. So it seems like this world was either partially corrupted by chaos, or at least had some cells of chaotic cultists. In any case, the legions continued to fight for months to subdue the rest of the worlds in the system, and in the end they were all incorporated to the Imperium. Despite murdering Hastus Genus in bad faith, Horus decided to show respect to the false emperor by holding a state funeral and burying his body in the necropolis of his palace, which is far more than he deserved if you ask me. The Gordian League is one of those civilizations that we really don't have much info on. All we really know is that they coexisted with the Xenos in a confederation of planets known as Shield Worlds. It fell to Lionel Johnson and the Dark Angels to liberate this region of space. However, he did so under the War Master's orders, who was already plotting to betray the Imperium. By tasking the Lion to take down the Gordian League, Horus hoped to keep him busy for a while. When news of his treason and the atrocity committed on Istvan III finally reached the Lion, he still had some 8 months of campaign ahead of him to liberate the region. Thus the Lion could only take a small part of his forces with him to the Forge World of Diamat to establish a staging point from where he could seek to answer the new threat that the traitors posed to the Imperium. The rest of the Dark Angels continued to fight the Gordian League, but we don't really know what happened to their human population. We were only told they were defeated. The Xenos they lived with were most probably purged like those of the Diasporex, but we don't know if the humans were enslaved or forced to join the Imperium, or if they too were exterminated for having collaborated with Xenos. The Olamic Quitude was an advanced human civilization that had survived for more than 15,000 years on their own, although rather than humans, a more fitting name would be post-humans or even abhumans, since in order to withstand the calamities of the Age of Strife, the population of the Olamic Quitude had merged with their technology to such an extent that their humanity was almost unrecognizable. Many of you might think that the Mechanicus does basically the same thing, right? Well, to settle it, let's see exactly to what extent the Olamic Quitude replaced their bodies with cybernetic enhancements. The members of the Quietude received cybernetic implants from a very early age, and by the time they were adults, the only parts of their organic bodies that remained were their brains, skulls, eyes, and spine. Everything else was cybernetic implants. The citizens of the Quietude wore silver electronic hoods that covered their heads, or what was left of them, displaying a hologram of a human face that could show different expressions of emotions. But when this hologram was damaged or when the subject died and the hologram turned off, all you could see was a fleshless skull and eyes without eyelids. A horrifying sight indeed. So yeah, the Olamic Quitude goes much further than the Mechanicus, because, to begin with, implants in the Mechanicus are voluntary, and also, the Mechanicus consider the human form to be sacred, so despite being turned into cyborgs that seem far removed from humanity, they will still retain more of their humanity than those in the Olamic Quitude. In addition, the members of the Quietude were interconnected through a kind of digital network similar to Wi-Fi or the Noosphere, through which they could communicate quickly to coordinate, analyze threats, and respond efficiently. Despite their high level of cybernetic implants, the Quietude still saw themselves as the pinnacle of human development and the legitimate heirs to humanity's destiny. The Quietude lived on a nameless world in advanced hive cities protected by artificially extended layers of ice, which added even more layers of defense to their cities against external attacks. This civilization was discovered by the 40th Expeditionary Fleet shortly before the Council of Nicaea. After establishing contact, the Olamic Quitude proved hostile, attacking the Imperial ships and managing to capture part of the crew of one of the ships to torture them and perform vivisection on them to learn more about these humans. And this is just gruesome. I mean, dissecting a human while still alive to understand how their organs work is truly appalling. And I mean, if the Olamic Quitude were so advanced and possessed so much knowledge, and if they themselves had been human at some point, what need did they have to vivisect other humans to understand how their organs worked? Couldn't they, I don't know, try something less invasive like scanning them or something? Perhaps this is an example of just how far this lost branch of humanity had fallen in its pursuit of knowledge and its fusion with technology, that they had even forgotten how the standard human body worked. According to the Olamic Quitude, the information gained from these vivisections showed that the humans of the Imperium of Man were simply inferior and were imposters who sought to claim mankind's heritage, something they would not tolerate, for in their view, they were the legitimate heirs to the future of mankind, and they would spread throughout the galaxy to take what was rightfully theirs. Obviously, this was directly opposed to the Imperial truth, and as the 40th Expeditionary Fleet saw that it was struggling against the advanced technology of the Olamic Quitude, it called out for reinforcements from the Space Marines, and the Space Wolves answered their call. Upon arriving to their homeworld, the Space Wolves swiftly assaulted the world's orbital station, where they faced robust and agile cybernetic troops and formidable defenses. However, these defenses were no match for the Adeptus Astartes of the Vilca Fenrica, who captured the station with relative ease. Subsequently, the Imperial army deployed on the surface to attack the hives directly, but despite being supported by Titans and super heavy tanks, the defenses of the Olamic Quitude were formidable. Their lamp-like defensive towers fired beams that wreaked havoc on the Imperial ranks. As for their forces, the Quietude had 3 types of warriors enhanced with advanced cybernetic implants. The smallest and lightest were called Graciles, similar in size to an ordinary human but much faster and deadlier thanks to their enhancements. Above them stood the Robusts, which, as their name suggests, stood out for their strength and endurance, reaching similar proportions to those of a Space Marine, and equipped with energy shields that could be modified after analysing the enemy's attack pattern. These Robusts wielded gravity penetrators that could fire a gravitational pulse to propel an ultra-dense projectile at incredible speeds that could easily penetrate power armor and fusion beam weapons similar to the melters of the Imperium. The most elite forces of the Quietude were known as the Super Robusts, colossal cyborgs with 2 heads and 4 arms, twice the height of a Space Marine. These towering cyborgs were armed with a wide variety of melee weapons, including hook-shaped tulwa blades and huge kinetic hammers. These kinetic hammers were similar to the Imperium's thunder hammers and could take down an Astartes in power armor with a single devastating blow. And just for a second, look at that cyborg monstrosity. If you think this thing is still human, you have strayed too far from the Emperor's light, my friend. Also, since the only thing left of their bodies was their nervous system and spine, the warriors of the Quietude were quite resistant to attacks that didn't damage the few organs they had left. As a result, the mortal humans of the Imperial army were having a hard time against this army of hyper-advanced cyborgs. And so the Space Wolves told them to stop feeding the enemy and ordered them to retreat to opt for a less conventional option. Since their cities withstood bombardment from orbit, and their armies were tough enough to resist a major offensive involving heavy tanks and Titans, the Space Wolves thought,
"This space station we took in the name of Rus is the size of a small moon, yes? What if we, I don't know, drop it on the surface and see what happens?"
And that's precisely what they did. They moved the station out of its orbit and onto a collision course with the planet. The space station crashed into the planet with a force of tens of thousands of nuclear warheads, devastating the ice shields and the cities they protected. Now that their cities were damaged and burning, the Imperium launched another major offensive with Imperial Army, Titans and Space Wolves, and this time they were able to achieve victory and annihilate all members of the Olamic Quitude. Now you might think this was a great success, however it was a bitter victory, because it would later be discovered that the same space station that the Space Wolves hurled against the planets like an enormous rock in true Orc style turned out to be an STC library containing all the technology and knowledge accumulated by the Olamic Quitude and who knows how many other relics from the Dark Age. So yeah, the Space Wolves are definitely to blame for this reckless action. But on the other hand, I mean, why on earth would you put all your most valuable technology, your goddamn STCs, repositories of mankind's cumulative knowledge, floating in space, where anyone can destroy it far easier than if it were buried deep down in a bunker somewhere? I mean, these guys from the Olamic Quitude believe themselves to be the pinnacle of mankind, but it seems like they dumped all their points into intelligence and left common sense at 0. I mean, it's basically storing mankind's greatest treasure in the cosmic equivalent of a glass shed. It's just utterly mental. Anyway, incompetence aside, all that knowledge would have been invaluable to the Imperium. Who knows how much the technology of the Imperium could have advanced if they were able to get their hands on the SCC library of the Olamic Quitude. Sadly, however, thanks to the Space Wolves and the incompetence of the Olamic Quitude, we will never know. Finally, we arrive at the Auretian Tecnocracy. The Auretian Tecnocracy was a peaceful human civilization spread throughout several systems with a capital world known as Aureus. Their technology seemed equal and in some instances superior to that of the Imperium, since they possessed some STCs the Imperium did not, and apparently also had an organization that was somewhat similar to the Mechanicum. Their leader even held the title of Fabricator Consul, a similar title to that of the Fabricator General of Mars. Also, this Fabricator Consul had bionic and cybernetic implants akin to those of the adepts of the Mechanicum. The Auretian Tecnocracy was discovered by the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet of Horus Lupercal. However, this was when Horus had already been corrupted by chaos and was already plotting his grand rebellion against the Emperor. So you can probably imagine how this is going to play out. The first direct encounter with the Auretian Tecnocracy was aboard the Vengeful Spirit, when the Fabricator Consul came to meet Horus in person and begin the diplomatic process. The Fabricator arrived with an escort of warriors from the Technocracy's military branch, known as the Brotherhood, who wore power armor and carried bolter weapons similar to those of the Space Marines. However, the warriors of the Brotherhood were mere humans with no genetic enhancements, and their bolters seemed to not have magazines, suggesting that maybe they were somewhat more advanced, with a reloading system integrated into the bolter itself. When Horus spoke of the Fabricator Consul, he asked him if his society possessed STCs, and when the Consul said they did, Horus instantly took out his bolt pistol and executed him on the spot with a shot to the head. The Sons of Horus swiftly reacted to their primarch, massacring the warriors of the Brotherhood who had came with the Consul. To justify such a terrible act, Horus said that the Consul had a weapon hidden within his staff with which he allegedly intended to assassinate him. Now this obviously was a blatant lie. For starters, I highly doubt that Technocracy had a weapon capable of slaying a Primarch in one blow, no matter how advanced their tech was. On the other hand, Horus was planning to seize the STCs of the Auretian Tecnocracy and give them to the Mechanicum in exchange for their support in his rebellion against the Emperor. And so, with Horus's vile treason, the war against the Technocracy began. The Sons of Horus and World Eaters were unleashed and carried out a brutal campaign during 10 months, laying waste to the Auretian Tecnocracy's worlds. Apparently, this was one of the most difficult campaigns of the entire Great Crusade for the Sons of Horus, as the Brotherhood's forces, despite not being genetically modified, were well equipped, disciplined and organized, and operated in a similar way to the Legiones Astartes. They even had armored vehicles similar to those of the Space Marines, and aircraft that were more advanced than Imperium's Thunderhawks, and their citadels were heavily fortified and offered great resistance. So much resistance did the Technocracy offer that eventually part of the Emperor's children also joined the campaign, and even then, with 3 legions involved, the Imperium suffered heavy casualties. Victory was finally achieved after the attack on the Iron Citadel with a 2-pronged assault by the Sons of Horus and the World Eaters, led by Angron himself. This final assault was a bloodbath, especially on the part of Angron and his World Eaters, who slaughtered both Brotherhood soldiers and innocent civilians alike. Another reason why this campaign might have taken so long is that Horus would use it to identify the members of his legion who were still loyal to the Emperor and who would join his new cause. Regardless, however, the Auretian Tecnocracy still offered fierce resistance. Ultimately, the Tecnocracy was destroyed, and Horus offered their STCs to the Mechanicum, along with the promise that if they joined him, he would allow them to study whatever technologies they desired. Thus, Kelbor Hal, Fabricator General of Mars, pledged his support to Horus's cause. The misfortune of the destruction of the Auretian Tecnocracy certainly has to do with Horus's plans to betray the Emperor. But what if Horus hadn't been corrupted? What would have happened then? Well, the Mechanicus would certainly not be pleased to see another human civilization using STCs and would try by all means to get hold of them, perhaps even starting an unprovoked war and eradicating the Technocracy to seize their technology and keep the technological monopoly they hold on the Imperium. On the other hand, it also depended on whether or not the Technocracy would agree to become part of the Imperium, because if they refused, Horus would be forced to subdue them anyway. But likely it would have been achieved with much less unnecessary bloodshed. However, this is all mere speculation. The bitter truth is that the ambition of Horus led him to destroy the Tecnocracy in a brutal war and sell their technology to the Mechanicum to assure their support in his coming rebellion against the Emperor. Well, there you have it, a few more independent human civilizations of the Great Crusade. Which one was your favourite? Personally, I found the Olamic Quitude to be one of the most interesting non-imperial human civilizations of this era. Maybe it's because they're all cyborgs which makes them stand out from the rest, but in any case, I did find them fascinating. Anyways, that's enough from me for now. If you liked the video, you know the drill. Leave a like and subscribe for more content. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you soon in the next video.